Within a tent pitched on the banks of the Volga River, 6 warriors lurk in the shadows. The year is 922. The young woman who enters understands what is about to happen, for she has witnessed this ritual before. Yet, she has never been in this position. Her name is Sigrid, a detail the Arab chronicler observing through the tent's fabric will fail to document. His account will only mention her youth, her service to the deceased chieftain, and that she volunteered to accompany him into the great beyond. The 3rd warrior has just concluded his part. A 4th now approaches. Sigrid utters fractured Norse, a language she acquired over 2 years of bondage following the destruction of her Slavic village. "I see my master," she proclaims, speaking to no one and yet to all, her words reaching the old woman, known as the Angel of Death, who stands in the corner, heating a blade over glowing coals. He summons me to his hall. The 4th warrior, however, is indifferent to her visions, as is the 5th. By the time the 6th has finished with her, Sigrid has fallen silent, no longer speaking of what she sees. The Angel of Death draws near, holding both a rope and a blade, one for the final breath, the other for absolute certainty. Outside, the crowd's singing intensifies, a deliberate effort to drown out any sounds that might escape the tent. In just 10 minutes, Sigrid's body will be set ablaze on the funeral ship, alongside the chieftain who claimed her as property. She will become smoke, a fleeting memory, and then nothing. And yet, Sigrid was one of the fortunate ones. She knew the precise moment her torment would cease. She could count the minutes until her release. Most captive women, however, were forced into a system engineered to make them beg for a final end that would never arrive. What the Vikings established was far from simple slavery. It was an intricate architecture of female suffering, a truly grim piece of dark history. It was so elaborate that Arab chroniclers, Byzantine historians, and European monks all concurred they had witnessed something unparalleled in its cruelty. This is the chapter of dark history that many have tried to erase. But before we delve deeper into the shadows of Norse civilization, if you appreciate uncovering these hidden truths, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more content just like it. Also, please leave a comment below to let me know where you are watching from. Meanwhile, Sister Ethelred pushed herself further into the grain storage. The sound of Norse voices grew menacingly close. It was June 8th, in the year 793, on the sacred island of Lindisfarne, off Northumbria's coast. Merely an hour before, she was transcribing manuscripts in the scriptorium. Now, she was huddled in the dark, her lungs filling with grain dust, hearing noises she never thought possible within the monastery's sacred walls. Peering through the cracks of the wooden storehouse, she witnessed warriors sorting through their captives. Her own friend, Bridget, was being dragged by the hair towards the shore, where unfamiliar longships were moored. Bridget had always been strikingly beautiful, her auburn hair a beacon that captured the sunlight during morning prayers. Now, that very beauty had sealed her fate. The Norsemen sorted the women into groups with the chilling efficiency of a farmer culling livestock. The young and beautiful were placed in one, the older yet still strong in another. The elderly and the infirm were granted a swift end, their bodies left abandoned where they fell. A hand suddenly plunged into the grain right beside her, its fingers closing around her arm. The warrior who dragged her from her hiding place had piercing blue eyes and reeked of sea salt and spilled blood. He grunted something in his own tongue before violently shoving her toward the ever-growing line of captives. Sister Ethelred, who had dedicated her life to Christ at the age of 14 and spent 12 years in serene contemplation, was about to learn the horrifying reality of what the Vikings did to the women they seized. The voyage by ship was a redefinition of suffering itself, with 40 women crammed into a space built for only 20. For the first 2 days, there was no food. Water came only when waves broke over the side, forcing them to lick the salty moisture from wooden planks that countless captives before them had also licked clean. The women were categorized by their perceived value, and even in the pitch-black hold below deck, the warriors knew precisely which ones had been chosen and for what specific purposes. Ethelred soon learned to distinguish the different kinds of visits. Sometimes the warriors came for raw violence, other times for different, unspeakable acts, and sometimes they came merely to stare, to appraise their share of the spoils that awaited. The torturous journey from Lindisfarne to Norway lasted for 11 days. By the 5th day, 2 of the women had perished. Their bodies were unceremoniously tossed into the sea. By the 8th day, Sister Ethelred had ceased to pray. God felt impossibly distant from this floating wooden tomb, gliding across the black water. Upon reaching the shores of Norway, The division of spoils began at once. The raid leader asserted his right to the first choice, selecting 6 women for himself. Among them was Bridget. His warriors then made their selections, their order determined by reputation and the valor they had displayed in the raid. Ethelred went to a farmer named Gunnar, who needed field workers. She watched Bridget led away toward the chieftain's hall and thought her friend's fate must be better. She was wrong. 20 years later, Ethelred would die in Norway, her hands destroyed by decades of grinding grain, her back permanently bent from carrying impossible loads. She never learned what happened to Bridget initially, though she heard rumors through the elaborate networks that enslaved women developed. Bridget had lasted 3 months in the chieftain's hall before being sold to a trader heading east. From there, she vanished into the vast Viking slave networks that stretched from Iceland to Constantinople. The night Lindisfarne fell was not unique. It was the template for 3 centuries of raids that would transform northern Europe. Every monastery, every village, every isolated farm faced the same possibility. The ships could appear any dawn, and when they did, the women knew their lives as human beings were over. But Bridget was beautiful, and beauty in Viking captivity was a curse beyond imagination. The morning after a successful raid on a Frankish village, Chieftain Ragnar Ironhand walked slowly between rows of captured women. His men had arranged them by approximate age and apparent health. 200 women knelt in the mud of the temporary camp, their homes still smoking in the distance. Ragnar carried a staff that he used to lift chins, turn faces toward the light, inspect his new property. He separated them into 3 categories with practiced efficiency. The first group, laborers, included older women and those showing signs of hard living. These would work fields, grind grain, and maintain households until their bodies failed. The second group, breeders, consisted of healthy young women of childbearing age. They would produce more slaves, their children automatically inheriting their mother's status. The third group, marked for special purposes, included the beautiful, the noble, and the very young. Marie was 30, a mother of 4 who had watched Vikings cut down her husband in their doorway. She went to the laborer group. Her hands showed she knew how to work, and her sturdy build suggested years of productive labor remained. She would spend 16 hours a day grinding grain in Ragnar's household, her fingers gradually deforming from the repetitive motion until they looked like twisted roots. 8 years she would last before her body simply stopped functioning, worn out like a tool used past breaking. Isabel was 16, daughter of a minor nobleman who had tried to organize resistance. She went to the breeder group. Within a month, she would understand what that categorization meant. Within a year, she would give birth to her first child, a boy who would never know his father's name. Over the next decade, she would produce 7 children, all born into slavery, all separated from her as soon as they could work. The Viking economy ran on this multiplication of human property. Marguerite possessed the kind of beauty that transcended circumstances. 20 years old, with features that remained striking even through tears and mud, she went to the Special Purposes group. Her fate diverged from the others immediately. While Marie and Isabel would remain in Scandinavia, Marguerite would be cleaned, fed better food, and taught basic phrases in multiple languages. She was an investment, being prepared for sale to the highest bidder in the great slave markets of the East. The selection process revealed the economic precision underlying Viking raids. This was not random violence, but calculated harvesting. Each category of woman had specific market values and designated purposes within the elaborate machinery of Norse slavery. The Vikings had industrialized human suffering with an efficiency that would not be matched until the Atlantic slave trade, 7 centuries later. Ragnar's selections that morning were replicated across hundreds of raids each year. Vikings developed expertise in evaluating human property instantly. They could determine a woman's approximate age by her teeth, her capacity for work by her hands, her breeding potential by her hips. They knew which ethnicities commanded premium prices in which markets. Frankish women brought good prices in Ireland. Irish women were valued in Iceland. Slavic women commanded the highest prices in Byzantine markets. The economic calculations went deeper. A woman who could weave was worth 3 times one who couldn't. A woman who could read and write, especially in Latin, she could be sold to Byzantine households desiring educated servants, while a woman skilled in herbs and healing would be invaluable in many Viking homes. Every skill she possessed increased her market value. Every capability promised a longer life, though Marie would soon learn that survival itself was a questionable blessing. Her fate was sealed that very first day, when she was led to the grinding stones, two immense circular slabs, one stacked upon the other, moved by a wooden handle in constant, grueling rotation. Grain was poured from above, flour emerged from below, and the woman turning the handle existed for the sole purpose of maintaining this relentless transformation. The woman she replaced had perished just the day before, her heart finally failing after 7 years of the same repetitive motion. Marie took her place and began to push. The stones were crushingly heavy, and the labor was endless. Her hands were bleeding within mere hours. Meanwhile, Isabel was about to learn the true meaning of her own designation. She was taken to a separate building, a dwelling for other young women, who explained the grim reality to her in hushed, fearful whispers. Her purpose was to be bred like livestock, and any children born would never be hers to raise. To resist was to invite a punishment carefully designed, a punishment that stopped just short of harming her reproductive value. Acceptance meant survival, a core tenet of this empire's dark history, though survival was a word that had to be entirely redefined. For Marguerite, the preparation began at once. She was bathed, her hair was styled to accentuate her features, and she was instructed on how to stand to best display her form. She learned basic phrases in Arabic, Greek, and Slavonic to her advantage. Each day, traders would come to inspect her, though the actual sale would wait until she reached a major market. She was merchandise being readied for display. The better her presentation, the higher her price would soar. But in this world, survival wasn't measured in years. It was measured by how many times one could be broken before finally shattering. The auction block in Dublin, a testament to this trade, stood 15 feet high to ensure perfect visibility. This catered to the hundreds of buyers crowding the market square. The year was 852, and Dublin had been grotesquely transformed from an Irish settlement into the Vikings' western headquarters for human trafficking, a hub of dark history. Princess Orlath stood exposed upon the platform, her royal lineage reduced to a mere selling point to inflate her price. The auctioneer bellowed in 4 different languages. He described her qualities to a diverse crowd of Byzantine merchants, Moorish traders from Spain, and Norse settlers all the way from Iceland. He even addressed local Irish collaborators, those who profited from the agony of their own people. He stressed her nobility, her education, and her supposed purity. Of course, this last point was an assumption rather than a verified fact, as any such verification would only lower the price by suggesting the merchandise was damaged. The bidding began at 12 marks of silver. A Byzantine merchant immediately raised it to 15, knowing full well the attention an Irish princess would command. Such a prize would draw attention in the slave markets of Constantinople. An Icelandic settler countered with 18 marks, needing women for his ever-expanding household. The final price settled at a staggering 24 marks, paid by a trader who specialized in transporting high-value women along the lucrative eastern routes. Orlath's journey would take her through Sweden, down the great Russian rivers, and eventually to Baghdad, where her pale skin and red hair would make her an exotic prize, a curiosity to be owned in some wealthy merchant's household. But Orlath's sale was just a single transaction in a vast, brutal market that processed thousands of women every month. Dublin's infrastructure for this grim trade rivaled the ancient markets of Rome in scale and even surpassed them in chilling efficiency. Its holding pens could contain 500 women at once. Designated feeding stations provided just enough sustenance to preserve their value without incurring excessive cost, while medical inspectors ensured the sick were swiftly isolated to prevent epidemics. The Welsh girl, known as Branwen, had been sold 16 times in just 2 years, a forgotten footnote in this dark history, with each sale taking her further and further from her home. She passed through countless Viking settlements, serving briefly in each before being resold. This constant state of movement was entirely deliberate. Women who remained in one place for too long might form bonds. They might organize resistance, or worse, they might become human in the eyes of their owners. The trade demanded they remain in motion, perpetually displaced, forever foreign. In one of the holding pens, a Pictish woman gave birth on straw that had not been changed in weeks. The infant, if it survived, was destined for a life of slavery, though mortality rates in the pens exceeded 60%. The mother would be granted 3 days to recover before her duties resumed. Before returning to the auction block, her recent pregnancy advertised as proof of fertility. Buyers appreciated confirmation that their investments could multiply themselves. A Frankish noblewoman named Elisande attempted to buy her own freedom, offering information about hidden gold in her family's estates. The traders listened to her information, sent men to retrieve the gold, then sold her anyway. The concept of honor in dealings with slaves was considered absurd. They were property, and property could not make deals. The price variations revealed the precise commodification of female humanity. A virgin between 14 and 18 might bring 20 marks. The same woman, no longer virgin, dropped to 12 marks. A woman over 25 brought 8 marks. If she showed no specialized skills, a woman over 35 brought 4 marks, unless she possessed exceptional abilities. A pregnant woman might bring 15 marks with the understanding that she carried potential additional property. Skills created premium categories. A woman who could illuminate manuscripts might bring 30 marks from monasteries, seeking to continue their work despite lacking trained monks. A woman with medical knowledge might bring 40 marks from settlements needing healers. Musical ability, particularly singing, could double a woman's value for wealthy households seeking entertainment. 3 ships arrived weekly during trading season, each carrying 30 to 60 women gathered from raids across the Christian world. The logistics required extraordinary coordination, food and water for the journey, security to prevent escapes, medical knowledge to minimize losses, and extensive networks to identify buyers. The Vikings had created the medieval world's most sophisticated human trafficking system. One shipment of 30 women from Francia to Iceland demonstrates the trade's brutal mathematics. 2 women jumped overboard on the 3rd day, preferring drowning to whatever awaited them. 5 died during the journey from disease, violence, or despair. The remaining 23 were distributed among Icelandic settlers who had placed orders in advance. Each woman represented a specific request: young for breeding, old for fieldwork, beautiful for status display, skilled for specialized labor. The woman who jumped overboard left behind a daughter in the ship's hold. The child, perhaps 7 years old, watched her mother choose death over slavery. She would remember that choice for the rest of her life in Iceland, where she would grow up as property, have children as property, and die as property, on an island where the ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, freedom always visible, but forever unreachable. Trading seasons followed predictable patterns. Spring brought fresh captives from early raids. Summer saw peak volume as Viking fleets returned from extended campaigns. Autumn brought final sales before winter made sea travel impossible. Winter meant reduced prices for merchants willing to maintain inventory through the frozen months. Each season had its own cruel rhythms. Those sold to Iceland faced a unique horror. They were entering an island prison, where escape meant freezing death in endless ocean. At the Thing, Iceland's General Assembly at Thingvellir, in the year 970, the law speaker stood on the rock platform and recited, from memory, the section of Groggus's law concerning female thralls. His voice carried across the gathered crowd as he spoke words that had been refined over generations to completely erase female humanity within legal frameworks. A thrall woman's body belongs entirely to her master. She cannot refuse any use of her person. Her children belong to her master. She cannot own property. She cannot bear witness. She cannot seek compensation for any harm. She exists outside law, except as her master's possession. These were not abstractions, but daily realities for thousands of women across the Norse world. The law created a state of living death where women existed physically, but had no legal existence as persons. They were animate property, breathing objects, conscious possessions, with no more rights than furniture or livestock. The case being tried that day illustrated the system perfectly. Thorstein Redbeard had killed his neighbor's female thrall, named Osa, during a dispute over field boundaries. The dead woman had been caught in the middle when Thorstein struck at his neighbor with an axe. The legal question was not murder but property damage. The judgment required Thorstein to pay her replacement value, 8 marks of silver, for a woman of approximately 20 years who could weave. No additional punishment, no consideration of the life ended, simply a commercial transaction to compensate for destroyed property. Asa had been captured in Ireland 5 years earlier. She had learned Norse, adapted to Iceland's harsh climate, and developed exceptional skill in weaving that made her valuable to her owner. She had even borne 2 children, who now served in the same household. None of this mattered legally. Her death was recorded in the same manner as the loss of sheep in a storm, a regrettable destruction of assets requiring financial compensation. The Gragas laws went further in their dehumanization. A fascinating provision called the morning gift tradition allowed masters to lend female thralls to guests as hospitality gestures. Refusing such use was not legally possible. The woman became a temporary gift, passed between men like cups of mead. Any children resulting from such arrangements automatically became the property of the woman's owner, regardless of the father's status. Ragnhild experienced this system when her master hosted a gathering of 5 chieftains to discuss a raiding alliance. For a week, she was passed among the guests nightly. By the meeting's end, she was pregnant. 9 months later, she gave birth to a son whose father could have been any of 6 men. The child was nobody's son, everybody's property, raised as a slave with no identity beyond his mother's servitude. The laws addressed every contingency of female slavery with disturbing thoroughness. If a thrall woman was injured by someone other than her owner, compensation went to the owner, not the injured woman. If she was permanently disabled, her value decreased, and the owner could seek the difference from whoever caused the damage. The woman's suffering was irrelevant. Only the economic impact on her owner mattered. Gudrun discovered this when a visiting trader assaulted her so violently she could no longer work. Her owner demanded compensation not for Gudrun's pain, but for the loss of her labor capacity. The trader paid 3 marks, the difference between a functional thrall and a damaged one. Gudrun received nothing except continued servitude in a body that would never fully heal. The inheritance laws created generational bondage that seemed impossible to escape. Children of thrall women were automatically thralls, regardless of their father's status. Even if a free man acknowledged paternity, even if he wanted to claim the child, the law was absolute. The mother's status determined everything. Freedom could not be inherited through fathers. Slavery passed through mothers like a curse in the blood. This created situations of extraordinary cruelty. Free men might develop genuine affection for thrall women, might consider their children beloved, might want to grant freedom. The law forbade it without the owner's permission, which required purchasing both mother and children at full market value. Few could afford such expense. Many children grew up knowing their fathers, seeing them daily, but remaining property that could be sold away at any moment. The legal system also created elaborate rules about sexual access that revealed the intersection of property law and human violation. An owner could use his female thralls without restriction. He could allow family members the same privilege. He could grant permission to guests. He could rent access for fees. But if someone used a female thrall without permission, it was not considered assault on the woman, but theft of services from the owner. The crime was economic, not moral. One provision seemed to offer mercy but actually deepened cruelty. If a female thrall bore her master 3 children who survived to adulthood, she could theoretically earn freedom, but the conditions were nearly impossible. The children had to survive in a world where slave infant mortality exceeded 50%. They had to reach adulthood still alive and capable of work. The mother had to survive 3 pregnancies and remain valuable enough that her freedom wouldn't be an economic loss. Most importantly, the master had to honor an agreement he could revoke at any time. Across 4 generations of meticulously kept Icelandic records, less than a dozen women ever managed to secure their freedom through this clause. The vast majority perished in the attempt, their bodies exhausted by constant pregnancies while still performing grueling labor, as their own children witnessed their mother's desperate pursuit of an impossible freedom, coming to understand that their very existence was simultaneously their mother's greatest hope and just another shackle in her chains. Yet, Viking law did more than just permit such brutalities. It forged something far more sinister, a piece of dark history where these acts became ingrained family traditions. They were passed down from father to son as if they were a treasured inheritance. The wedding celebration for Jarl, Eric, and Brianna was held in the very hall, where the stains of her own father's blood still marked the floorboards. Only 3 days had gone by since Eric's warriors had smashed through the gates of her family's fortress in Ireland. With her own eyes, she had seen Eric personally sever her father's head from his shoulders. Now, she stood at his side, draped in her deceased mother's wedding gown, the delicate fabric still holding the faint scent of her mother. Eric's men jeered, making crude jokes about breaking the Irish mare, placing bets on how long it would take for her spirit to shatter. Some wagered a week. Others, more familiar with this grim process, knew it could take months, or even years. The total subjugation of a noblewoman was an art that demanded patience, and the methodical dismantling of every shred of her identity and will to resist. Brianna was only 17 years old. Just 3 days prior, she had been preparing for a political marriage intended to unify two Irish kingdoms against the encroaching Norse threat. She was literate in Latin, fluent in 3 languages, and skillfully managed her father's entire household accounts. Now, she was a living trophy of Viking conquest, her forced marriage to Eric a brutal tool to legitimize his claim to her ancestral lands. Everyone gathered in that hall understood the chilling symbolism. The Irish nobility was being systematically absorbed, quite literally consumed by the relentless tide of Norse expansion. This grim chapter of their dark history followed a predictable and brutal pattern across the Viking world. Eliminate the men of fighting age, enslave the servants and common women, but reserve a different fate for the daughters of the nobility. They were to become the wives of their conquerors. Their very bodies were made into bridges, connecting shattered kingdoms to new Viking territories. These were not marriages. They were strategic absorptions, engineered to eradicate rival bloodlines, while simultaneously securing legal claims to the conquered lands. Eric himself had slain Brianna's father and her 2 brothers, along with 6 of her male cousins, during the siege of her family's fortress. He had then personally executed her uncle, who had surrendered under a false promise of mercy, and now he would father children with her children, who would carry her noble blood but be raised as Viking warriors. Her Irish lineage was destined to survive, only as a faint, whispered memory within Norse family trees. The political calculus behind this was ruthlessly effective. By marrying the daughters of the nobility, Viking warlords secured legitimate claims to land that pure conquest alone could never grant. The local populace might fight against a foreign invader, but they found it far more difficult to resist the children, who carried their own noble blood, even when those very children were raised to scorn their maternal heritage. These women were effectively turned into biological weapons in a generational war of assimilation. 3 such forced marriages from this era perfectly illustrate the pattern's horrifying consistency. In Scotland, the daughter of a vanquished Mormaer was forcibly wed to the Viking, who had strangled her father with his own bare hands. She would bear him 4 sons, all of whom grew up to lead devastating raids against their mother's kinsfolk. For 30 years, she lived as the wife of her father's murderer, raising children who celebrated the very victory that had been won over their own maternal grandfather. In Francia, a recently widowed noblewoman was forced to marry her husband's killer less than a month after his death. The Viking chieftain required her presence to maintain his grip on her late husband's vast estates. She had personally witnessed her husband fall while trying to defend their home. Now, she was forced to share a bed with his slayer, while her own children from her first marriage were raised as common slaves in the very home that was once theirs. And in Saxony, a princess was married to the Viking warlord who had burned her city to the ground. She had watched as he ordered the public execution of 300 citizens for their refusal to submit. On their wedding day, he wore armor still blackened with soot from the inferno. Their children would be raised on epic tales of their father's glorious victory, never knowing their own mother had witnessed him orchestrate the massacre of their grandparents. This brutal aspect of their dark history created children who were the living embodiment of conquest, often bearing the features of their defeated mothers. But raised in the image of their Viking fathers, they spoke Norse, viewing their mothers' native tongues merely as practical tools for managing the conquered peoples. While they openly worshipped Norse gods, their mothers offered secret prayers to Christ. This brutal chapter of dark history reveals a successful cultural annihilation, the systematic erasure of one identity and its replacement by another. The psychological warfare, however, reached far beyond the women themselves. Every person who had once served Brianna's family was now enslaved to Eric. They were forced to watch the daughter of their former lord share meals with his killer. They saw her belly swell with the conqueror's child. They knew instinctively that any resistance would bring dire consequences upon her. She had become a living hostage, her safety a guarantee of their compliance. Her treatment was directly contingent on their submission. Yet, some women devised ways to resist within these impossible confines. They taught their children Irish lore, cleverly disguised as Norse sagas. They preserved their genealogies in songs that appeared harmless, maintained secret contact with surviving kin, and slowly administered poisons to their husbands with substances that mimicked the symptoms of natural illness, but most simply endured, their spirits worn away over time like stone by water. One woman's successful revenge, however, stands out in the historical record of this dark history. Gudrun of the Hebrides was wed to the Viking who had slaughtered her father and brothers. For 10 long years, She flawlessly performed the role of a dutiful wife, bearing him 3 children, managing his estate, and earning his unwavering trust. She studied his routines, his weaknesses, his very allergies. In the 10th year, she prepared a feast featuring mushrooms she knew would deliver a slow, agonizing death. He perished over 3 days, believing he had merely eaten spoiled food. As his widow, she inherited all his property, finally able to raise their children free from his tyrannical presence. But Gudrun's revenge was an anomaly. Most women discovered that death, even the death of their tormentor, brought no true freedom. Viking law and custom ensured that widows were simply passed to brothers, sons, or other male relatives as property. The system was meticulously designed to prevent escape by any means, even through the death of a husband. These forced marriages created genealogical tangles that are still evident in DNA studies today. Modern Icelandic genetic research reveals that while the male lineage is predominantly of Norse origin, the female lineage is overwhelmingly Celtic, traced back mainly to Ireland and Scotland. These statistics give voice to thousands of women like Brianna, whose bodies became the vessels through which the Viking expansion achieved a permanent genetic conquest. But while some may have wished for death's escape, most women discovered there were fates crafted to make even death an unattainable mercy. The funeral preparations commenced 10 days before the chieftain's body was to burn on the banks of the Volga River. The Rus Vikings readied a ceremony designed to broadcast their wealth, their power, and their absolute dominion over both life and death. The Arab chronicler Ibn Fadlan witnessed every detail, recording what he could bear to commit to paper, while implying horrors his ink refused to describe. This account from the dark history of the Rus is chilling. The selection of the girl came first. The chieftain's female slaves were assembled and asked who among them would follow their master into the afterlife. The word asked demands scrutiny. These women understood that a choice would be made regardless. Volunteering offered nothing more than the illusion of control. To refuse meant being selected anyway, but also facing additional torments for your reluctance. A young woman named Sigrid stepped forward. She was 19, captured from a Slavic village 2 years earlier. She had learned enough of the Norse language to recognize that her value for survival was rapidly declining. Younger captives had arrived, her skills were common, and her beauty was fading under the strain of brutal treatment. Volunteering for death might have seemed like the only way to choose her own exit before even worse fates could be forced upon her. Once selected, Sigrid entered a surreal, suspended state between the living and the dead. For 10 days, she was treated as a figure both sacred and doomed. She was provided with better food and strong drink that kept her intoxicated but conscious, and new garments that marked her as chosen for a divine purpose. She was guarded constantly, never left alone, never given the slightest chance of escape or self-harm that might disrupt the coming ceremony. The first 3 days established the grim rhythm of her fate. Each morning, Sigrid was lifted onto a platform, where she was made to proclaim that she could see into the afterlife. "I see my master," she would call out, even as his body lay preserved in a temporary tomb. "He is calling me to his great hall." The crowd roared at these visions, taking them as absolute proof that their leader awaited her in Valhalla. The potent brew was essential. It kept Sigrid functional enough for her role, yet too disoriented to comprehend the horror unfolding. This mixture, as detailed in Norse records, contained fermented honey, herbs to induce mild hallucinations, and stimulants to ward off total unconsciousness. She drifted through the following days in a haze of manufactured bliss, physically present but mentally absent. Then, from days 4 through 6, the warriors were introduced. Every night, a different man from the chieftain's most trusted circle would enter Sigrid's tent. This was framed as a profound honor, with these warriors ostensibly sending messages to their departed lord through the very woman destined to join him. Ibn Fadlan meticulously documents the loud, ritualistic singing that accompanied these visits, clearly intended to mask any other sounds. He records that 6 warriors took part over a span of 3 nights, yet his account turns intentionally obscure on the details, a frustrating silence that shrouds this piece of dark history. What Ibn Fadlan only hinted at can be pieced together from corroborating accounts. The Byzantine chronicler, Constantine Porphyrogenitus, detailed similar rites where the condemned woman was made into a living conduit, a way for men to connect with the dead through carnal acts. The Frankish historian, Adam of Bremen, also wrote of Swedish rituals, where the one to be sacrificed endured what he called shameful uses, before their end. The period from day 7 to day 9 was dedicated to preparing the physical stage. The great funeral ship was hauled onto the shore and laden with all the chieftain would require in the next life: his finest weapons, gold, his horses, his dogs, and finally, his preserved corpse. A large tent was raised upon the ship's deck, the very place where the final act would take place. Sigrid watched all this, knowing that every treasure added to the ship brought her own end nearer. On the 7th day, the old woman, known only as the Angel of Death, made her appearance. She was an immense figure, powerfully built, with eyes that held the cold experience of having presided over countless such events. Her purpose was to guarantee Sigrid's death at the appointed moment. She methodically prepared her instruments, a thick rope for strangulation and a wide-bladed knife to make certain. She also brought herbs to be burned, their smoke intended to conceal the scent of death. Her arrival signaled that the ritual had shifted from preparation to grim inevitability. The 9th day was for rehearsals. Sigrid was drilled on precisely where to stand, what words to utter, and how to conduct herself throughout the ceremony. She practiced raising the ceremonial cup. She rehearsed her last pronouncements. They showed her the tent where the final, terrible acts would be performed. Every moment was choreographed for the flawless execution of both the rite and the girl. The final day dawned with an unnerving stillness. The crowd assembled at first light. Hundreds of witnesses gathered to affirm their chieftain's magnificent journey to the afterlife. Sigrid was adorned in the most lavish garments she had ever possessed, with golden arm rings signifying her as the chosen one, and a cloak that had once belonged to the chieftain himself. She was hoisted onto the ship, where she began the prescribed rituals. She drank from 3 separate cups, dedicating the first to her mother and father, the second to all her departed kin, and the third to her master, who she was told awaited her in the next world. Each cup held a stronger dose of the stupefying concoction. After the 3rd cup, she was visibly unsteady, supported by 2 women who made sure she saw the ceremony through to its conclusion. Then, the grim proceedings of the 10th day began. 6 warriors were waiting inside the tent, the very same men who had visited her on previous nights. Only now it was broad daylight, with hundreds of eyes watching the structure's every shudder. They performed their final ritual with the woman who was to be their messenger to Valhalla. Ibn Fadlan notes that as each man emerged from the tent, he would loudly proclaim that he had acted out of devotion to his chieftain. Once the 6th warrior came out, the Angel of Death entered, her rope and blade in hand. What transpired next was concealed by the tent's walls, but the crowd could discern the violent shadows cast against the fabric. 2 women seized Sigrid's hands, while 2 men restrained her feet. The Angel of Death looped the rope around her neck as another figure pulled it taut from the other side. The strangulation reportedly lasted for several agonizing minutes. To leave no doubt, the broad blade was then plunged between her ribs. Sigrid's lifeless body was laid next to the chieftain's on the funeral bier. At last, fire arrows struck the oil-drenched wood. In mere moments, the entire vessel was a roaring inferno. The crowd cheered wildly as the column of smoke ascended, convinced it was carrying their leader and his devoted slave to paradise. By the time the sun set, nothing remained but smouldering ash and twisted metal. But Sigrid's fate was not unique. This brutal chapter of dark history was reenacted in countless ceremonies from Iceland to Russia. In regions where Viking chieftains died with enough wealth for such grand displays, the chronicler Adam of Bremen described a chilling ceremony he witnessed in Sweden. There, 5 women were consumed by fire alongside a deceased king. This is corroborated by archaeological evidence from Norway, which confirms multiple female bodies in ship burials, their skeletal positions strongly suggesting they did not perish from natural causes. A grim religious justification cloaked this brutality in sacred purpose. These women were not murdered, but transformed into eternal attendants. They were destined to serve in Valhalla just as they had in life, forever bound to masters whose ownership transcended even death. The crowds, meanwhile, celebrated these transformations as great honors, believing it was the greatest purpose an enslaved woman could ever achieve. But while these funeral sacrifices ended swiftly, the sacrifices of the living endured for decades. A 7-year-old named Astrid learned she was property on an otherwise ordinary morning when she tried to play with the blacksmith's daughter, who promptly pushed her away, spitting words Astrid had heard but never understood. Thrall brat. Her mother found her weeping behind the grain storage and was forced to explain what should never be explained to a child. They were not truly people. They were things that looked like people, but possessed no more rights than hammers or plows. Her mother's name was Ingrid, though she had been called Ife in her native island. Captured at 15 and bearing her first child at just 16, she had produced 4 children for her master's household, and each child automatically inherited her status, born into bondage by the simple fact of emerging from her body. The identity of the father was completely irrelevant. Even if he was a free man, even if he was the master himself, the children remained property. Astrid would grow up watching her mother serve as what the Norse chillingly called a morning gift, lent out to guests as casually as one might lend a tool. She learned to recognize the particular, vacant expression her mother wore when returning from such nights, as blank as fresh snow present, yet entirely absent. She watched her mother's body change through repeated pregnancies, with each child removed as soon as they could work, sold or redistributed according to the household's needs. This hereditary system, a cornerstone of this dark history, created a near mathematical impossibility of freedom. A female thrall's children were born thralls, and their children would be thralls in turn. The line continued until it was broken by death, or the impossibly rare act of manumission, which required purchasing one's own freedom at full market value. Most bloodlines that entered slavery in the 8th century remained enslaved 3 centuries later, in the 11th, spanning multiple generations who knew nothing but servitude. A telling example comes from a single household in Iceland around the year 960, where 3 generations of women lived in bondage. The grandmother, captured in Scotland, remembered freedom as a distant, fading dream. The mother, born into slavery, knew freedom only as an abstract concept. The granddaughter could not imagine freedom any more than she could imagine taking flight. Each generation related to their captivity in profoundly different ways, creating complex psychological dynamics within these enslaved families. The grandmother clung to her memories of Scotland, teaching her descendants words in a language they would never use, in a land they would never see. She represented a living connection to freedom, a reminder to the children that their bloodline had not always been designated as property. Her stories of life before slavery sounded like fairy tales to grandchildren who had never seen a single person who looked like them live a free life. The mother occupied a tragic middle space, born into slavery, but raised by someone who remembered what freedom felt like. She understood conceptually what had been lost, but she had no personal experience of it. Her identity was formed entirely within slavery's constraints. She could not teach her children to be free because she had never learnt it herself. She could only teach them how to survive as slaves, passing down strategies for avoiding punishment, for maintaining health despite harsh conditions, and for earning small privileges through absolute compliance. The granddaughter, however, knew nothing else. For her, slavery was not a condition but a core identity. She did not think of herself as a person who happened to be enslaved, but as a slave who happened to be person-shaped. The psychological damage from this dark history ran far deeper than mere submission. It was a complete internalization of her property status, an acceptance at the most fundamental level that she existed only as an extension of her owner's will. Children watched their mothers be violated repeatedly, understanding this as a normal and inevitable part of life. Their own future daughters grew up knowing they would experience what their mothers had experienced. Sons grew up with the agonizing knowledge that they could never protect their mothers, their sisters, or the daughters they might one day have. The emotional wounds deepened with each passing generation, as children inherited not only their legal status as property, but also a legacy of accumulated trauma. One family, whose story is pieced together from the sagas, suffered through 5 generations of unrelenting bondage. The matriarch, a woman seized from Francia, gave birth to 8 children. Her daughters, in turn, bore 23 grandchildren, and by the time the 5th generation arrived, more than 100 of her descendants were living as slaves throughout Iceland, Norway, and Denmark. An entire bloodline was reduced to mere chattel, their potential contributions to art, science, leadership, or even basic human joy completely obliterated by inherited servitude. This psychological devastation revealed itself in distinct behaviors that became common across all long-term enslaved populations. An extreme avoidance of conflict that surpassed mere caution, becoming a pathological inability to express any personal preference, a disassociation during acts of violence that hardened into permanent emotional numbness, and a state of hypervigilance that made deep sleep or genuine rest impossible. While these were survival adaptations, they inflicted deep damage that was passed on to their children, not just through learned behavior, but, as modern science now suggests, through epigenetic changes born from severe trauma, a truly grim aspect of this dark history. Some mothers, in their utter desperation, tried to shatter the cycle through the unthinkable act of infanticide, choosing to end their newborn's life rather than condemn it to slavery. Norse law, however, viewed this not as a tragedy but as property destruction, demanding the owner be compensated, completely ignoring the desperate motives of a mother trying to shield her child from a lifetime of inherited agony. The sagas offer chilling, fleeting mentions of deceased infants discovered hidden in haylofts or submerged in streams, their mothers having chosen the sharp pain of grief over the slow torment of watching another generation live in chains. The rampant sexual violence endured by female thralls forged tangled and painful bloodlines. Countless children grew up never knowing their father's identity. Others knew all too well but were forbidden from acknowledging the free men who conceived them. Some even saw their fathers every day, perhaps receiving a fleeting moment of kindness, all while remaining a piece of property that could be sold or bartered away. The psychological toll of this dark history, of knowing your own father while being owned by him, like livestock, created fractures in their identity that would never mend. The physical scars of slavery were also passed down through the generations. Malnutrition during pregnancy resulted in children born with predispositions to certain health issues, while the repetitive stress injuries from relentless labor became heritable weaknesses. The stunted growth caused by childhood labor meant each successive generation began life smaller, weaker, and more vulnerable. Their very bodies became living archives of this accumulated suffering, with each generation adding a new, painful chapter of damage. Language offered one of the few sanctuaries for preserving a sense of self. Enslaved mothers taught their children words from their native tongues, songs from a time before their capture, and stories that kept alive the shattered fragments of a free heritage. These linguistic treasures were carefully concealed from their masters, shared only in hushed whispers, passed down through generations as defiant proof that their identity was more than just property. Yet, some women would discover that not even death offered an escape from servitude, as the Vikings devised ways for them to serve even beyond the grave. At Hedeby, the dawn arrived not with birdsong, but with the clanking of chains long before the sun breached the horizon. The vast slave market in this Danish trading hub processed human lives with the cold efficiency of a modern logistics center. Women were brought in on ships from Ireland, England, and Francia in the west, while others were marched overland from the Slavic territories in the east. They all converged here, destined to be sorted, priced, and redistributed throughout the Viking world. This marketplace operated with a chilling, bureaucratic precision. Each woman was assigned a number, painted onto her shoulder with woad dye that would not fade for weeks. Meticulous records were kept detailing their origin, estimated age, observable skills, and overall physical state. The Vikings had engineered a comprehensive inventory management system for human beings centuries before such methods were applied to common goods. This particular morning, a coffle of 50 women had just arrived from Ireland. They were shackled together by iron collars linked with heavy chains, compelling them to move as one single, suffering organism. If one woman stumbled from sheer exhaustion, the chain would viciously jerk at the necks of the women both in front of and behind her. Over the course of their journey, they had learned to move in a grim rhythm, to anticipate one another's steps, effectively becoming a single, tragic creature with 50 heads and 100 legs. The sorting process began without delay. The women were segregated by their ethnicity, age, and apparent physical condition. Irish women were herded into one pen, Frankish women into another, and Slavic women into a third. This segregation was a matter of cold practicality, as different ethnic groups fetched different prices in various markets. Slavic women could command premium prices in the southern markets. Irish women were highly sought after in Iceland, and Frankish women were sold for high sums to Byzantine traders, revealing the international scale of this dark history. Within ethnic divisions came age-sorting girls under 14 inches. One group, women 14 to 25 inches, another 25 to 35 inches. A third, older women in a fourth. Each age range had specific market values and destinations. The youngest might be raised in households to be perfectly trained. The prime age, women faced immediate sale for maximum value. Older women went to agricultural operations, where their remaining labor could be extracted before disposal. The inspection process stripped away any remaining dignity. Buyers examined teeth to estimate age and health. They felt muscles to assess work capacity. They checked for pregnancy, disease, or injuries that might affect value. Women stood naked in lines while strangers evaluated them like livestock, discussing their bodies as merchandise. One coffle of 50 women demonstrates the trade's brutal logistics. They began their journey in Dublin, bound for Baghdad. The ship journey to Denmark took 5 days. 12 women were sold at Hedeby. The remaining 38 continued overland through Slavic territories. At each major trading post, a few more were sold or traded for supplies. By the time they reached Kiev, 23 remained. The river journey south claimed 3 more to disease. 20 reached Constantinople. Only 12 of the original 50 arrived in Baghdad. Each stage of the journey brought new horrors. Different crews of guards with different appetites, different languages, meaning inability to communicate needs or understand commands. Different climates requiring adaptation, while chained and underfed, the women who survived to final destinations had endured transformations that left them barely recognizable. As the people who had begun the journey, specialized markets developed for specific types of women. Constantinople preferred educated women who could serve as scribes or tutors. The Byzantine Empire's elaborate bureaucracy created demand for literate slaves who could manage correspondence in multiple languages. A woman who could read and write Latin, Greek, and Arabic might bring 50 marks of silver. Baghdad's markets sought young women for the harems of wealthy merchants. Beauty standards were precise and culturally specific. Pale skin, red or blonde hair, blue eyes, features that seemed exotic in the Islamic world. These women faced particular fates, disappearing into private households where they might live decades without ever being seen by anyone except their owners and other slaves. Iceland's market demanded strong women, capable of agricultural labor and textile production. The isolated island settlements needed women who could work fields, tend animals, spin, thread, and weave cloth through long winters. Beauty was less valuable than endurance. A plain woman who could work 18-hour days brought higher prices than a beautiful woman who might break under harsh conditions. Sweden developed markets for women skilled in specific crafts. A woman who could work iron brought premium prices. One who understood brewing commanded high value. Those with medical knowledge were particularly prized. The Vikings recognized that certain skills multiplied value and actively sought women with specialized capabilities. The infrastructure supporting these markets was vast slave catchers, operated like independent contractors, raiding isolated settlements to capture women and children for sale. Translators worked the markets, teaching basic Norse phrases to new captives, or serving as intermediaries in negotiations. Doctors, such as they were, kept women alive through journeys, understanding that dead merchandise brought no profit. The financial instruments developed for slave trading presaged modern commerce. Credit arrangements allowed buyers to purchase women with promised future payment. Insurance systems covered losses. During transport, investment partnerships pooled resources for large purchases. The Vikings created sophisticated financial mechanisms that would later be applied to other forms of trade. Some women were sold dozens of times, passing from owner to owner, like coins changing hands. Each sale meant new violence, new adaptation, new destruction of any stability or identity they might have built. The constant movement was often deliberate, preventing women from forming connections or organizing resistance. A Welsh woman named Gwenllian was sold 17 times over 4 years. Each sale moved her farther from home, first to Ireland, then to Norway, then to Iceland, then to Greenland. By the time she reached the edges of the known world, she had forgotten the sound of Welsh. She could string together broken phrases from 6 different tongues, yet was truly fluent in none. Her very identity had been systematically erased by a lifetime of constant displacement. However, the cruelest fate wasn't being sold just once. It was the curse of being valuable enough to be sold over and over. An escaped thrall, a woman named Yrsa, finally reached the northern coast of Iceland after 3 grueling days on the run. Her feet were ravaged from traversing jagged lava fields, her hands shredded from scrambling over volcanic rock, but she had made it to the ocean, the very edge of what she believed was freedom. It was then she truly comprehended the geography of her prison. Water stretched to an endless horizon in every direction, with no waiting ships in sight. Not a single speck of other land was visible. Even if she could somehow procure a boat, she had no idea which way to sail towards salvation. The closest landmass was Greenland, which was nothing more than another frozen prison. Beyond that lay an unforgiving ocean until Norway, a journey she could never survive in a small vessel. Freedom, she realized, was a geographical impossibility. Her recapture took a mere 2 days, as Iceland's sparse settlement pattern ensured any escape was destined to be temporary. There were no dense forests to offer even temporary concealment, no neighboring kingdoms to flee to, and no sympathetic communities that would ever harbor a fugitive. On this isolated island, every person knew every other, or at least knew someone who did. A strange woman journeying alone was instantly and unmistakably identified as an escaped thrall. When they dragged Yrsa back, her punishment was meticulously calculated, not death, which would squander her value, nor a mutilation that would impede her ability to work. Instead, they chose to hobble her, severing the tendons in her heels so they would heal improperly, leaving her able to work, but forever robbing her of the ability to run. She was condemned to spend her remaining years with a shuffling gait, a permanent, visible brand, marking her as one who had dared to seek freedom and learned the futility of her attempt. This brutal system of island bondage in Iceland and Greenland reveals a unique chapter in its dark history, one that created unparalleled psychological horrors. On the mainland, those in bondage could at least cling to the hope of escape. They could dream of reaching free territories, of finding communities that might offer sanctuary, or of disappearing into a crowd where they might finally blend in. The island thralls, however, faced the stark certainty that any attempt at escape meant only a grim death by ocean, volcano, or ice. The settlement of Iceland began in 874, and from its very inception, this nation's dark history was built upon the backs of thralls, who made up a vast portion of the population. The free settlers required a massive labor force to carve viable farms from the unforgiving volcanic soil. They brought thralls with them from Norway and captured many more during brutal raids on Scotland and Ireland. These enslaved people faced a landscape that seemed divinely engineered to prevent any escape. The island's interior was an uninhabitable desert of volcanic ash. Its coasts were lined with sheer, rocky cliffs battered by violent seas, and between settlements stretched miles of treacherous terrain that would claim the life of any unprepared traveler. The summer's perpetual daylight made hiding impossible, while the winter's oppressive darkness brought a lethal cold that could kill within hours. The island itself was a natural prison, far more secure than any man-made walls. A mass escape attempt in the year 912 ended in absolute disaster, as 23 thralls from different farms coordinated their desperate flight, their plan being to steal boats and make a perilous attempt to reach Scotland. They succeeded in reaching the coast and even managed to commandeer 2 small fishing vessels, but they possessed no knowledge of ocean navigation. Weeks later, both boats were discovered, washed ashore on Iceland's southern coast. All 23 souls had perished at sea, their bodies never to be recovered. For some women, a volcanic death was preferable to recapture. The island's volatile geology provided one final and irreversible form of escape. Some women would hurl themselves into geothermal hot springs, being boiled alive, while others simply walked into active lava flows, choosing instantaneous incineration over a lifetime of continued servitude. The volcano Hekla, in particular, became known as a place where the desperate ended their lives in fire rather than live another day in chains. The profound psychological impact of this geographic hopelessness, a grim testament to this dark history, created specific and devastating behavioral patterns. The island thralls exhibited higher rates of complete dissociation, a state where they would mentally shut down while their bodies mechanically continued to work. Many developed elaborate fantasy worlds, creating internal sanctuaries when an external one was impossible. Some even became catatonic, able to function physically but ceasing to respond to anything beyond the most direct commands. The isolation of Greenland was even more absolute. Its 2 small settlements demanded an immense amount of labor simply to survive in that profoundly harsh environment. But to escape was to face certain death in a brutal landscape of ice and stone. The ocean crossing to any other land took weeks by large ship, making any attempt in a small boat a suicidal gesture. The land itself offered no refuge for those on the run. The cold, starvation, or even polar bears would claim a fugitive's life long before they could ever taste freedom. For the women in Greenland, the gender imbalance brought on additional layers of horror. Free men outnumbered free women by a staggering 5-to-1, and as a result, enslaved women became communal property in ways that, surpassed even the grim realities common in Iceland. They were passed from man to man each night, treated as nothing more than tools or provisions to be shared. Their very bodies were treated as resources for the entire community, not even belonging to a single owner. This complete societal breakdown in Greenland forged a particularly bleak chapter of dark history. It created a lawless void where even the most basic Norse legal codes no longer applied. Assemblies were not held, and no law speakers were present to uphold ancient traditions. The settlements ran on the principle of pure force, with enslaved women trapped at the absolute bottom of a brutal hierarchy, maintained solely by violence. A woman could be ended for any reason or for no reason at all, her death going entirely unrecorded and unmourned. Despite this, some women dared to attempt long-term resistance. They tried work slowdowns and acts of sabotage, but in such small, isolated populations, any form of defiance was immediately and glaringly obvious. In communities of just a few hundred souls, there was no place to hide. Every action was witnessed, every whisper of resistance was heard, and punishment was always swift, brutal, and public. It served as a grim lesson to any others contemplating defiance. The multi-year resistance mounted by a group of Irish women in Iceland stands as a testament to both incredible courage and ultimate futility. They coordinated their efforts across 3 separate farms, methodically poisoning their captors with small doses of indigenous plants that induced sickness but not a swift end. Their goal was to weaken the free population to a point where the enslaved could rise up and seize control. This daring conspiracy unfolded over 2 years before it was discovered. All 15 women involved were burned alive in a horrific mass execution, a spectacle designed as a chilling warning to every slave on the island. Geography may have made escape impossible, but Viking ingenuity could make even submission a deadly gamble. A Saxon village watched as Norsemen began to emerge from the morning mist, advancing across their fields. The year was 866. Every family was forced to make the same terrible calculation that countless villages before them had confronted. Should they fight and witness their women subjected to unspeakable public horrors, or flee instantly and perhaps spare them the worst of it? They chose to flee. Within the hour, the entire village was evacuating south. They abandoned homes their ancestors had built generations ago, leaving behind food in the storehouses, tools in the workshops, everything they owned, except what they could carry on their backs. The Vikings arrived to find a ghost town, ripe with wealth for the taking, a victory won without a single battle. Their most potent weapon had worked flawlessly, and it wasn't the sword or the axe, it was their reputation. Tales from other ravaged villages traveled faster than the Viking longships themselves. Everyone knew the fate that awaited the women in a conquered settlement. The public humiliations, the chilling selection process, the lifetime of servitude that followed this dark history, deliberately spread and likely embellished, was the true source of their power. It triggered mass evacuations long before the Vikings ever appeared on the horizon. The mathematics of this terror were cold and precise. The story of one brutalized woman could spread like wildfire through family networks, trade routes, and even religious gatherings. These terrifying accounts would then reach hundreds of other women, who in turn would influence their families to flee at the first sign of a Viking sail. A single, spectacular act of cruelty could depopulate entire regions without a single sword being drawn. The Great Heathen Army, which invaded England in 865, employed this psychological warfare with chilling efficiency. After seizing the city of York, they didn't immediately press their advance. Instead, they held the city, allowing tales of what had befallen the women of York to fester and spread like a plague across the kingdom of Northumbria. By the time they finally marched out, they encountered almost no resistance. The local populations had already abandoned their homes, choosing flight over risking their women to the same fate as those in York. Avar the Boneless, one of the army's commanders, masterfully understood the propaganda value of his female captives. He would deliberately parade captured noblewomen through the very territories he planned to conquer next, displaying them in a state that sent a clear and silent message of what awaited any who dared to resist. These women, still alive but obviously broken, were more effective than any spoken threat or attempt at negotiation. They were living warnings, a horrific spectacle that traveled with the army. The Normandy raids became a chilling chapter in this dark history, demonstrating how efficiently terror, weaponized through women's bodies, could depopulate entire regions after Vikings publicly brutalized the wife and daughters of the Count of Rouen. Neighboring territories witnessed a mass exodus as families abandoned productive farms rather than risk a similar, harrowing fate. The economic disruption caused by these fleeing populations far exceeded what the Vikings could have accomplished through direct destruction alone. Chronicles from the era describe the terrifying speed of this fear transmission. A monastery assaulted on a Monday would spawn tales that reached settlements 50 miles away by Thursday. Families would be on the move by Friday, and by the following Monday, the Vikings would find deserted villages, ripe for effortless plunder. This efficiency surpassed any military campaign that depended on actual combat. These calculated strategies included timing their attacks for the greatest psychological shock. Raiders would strike during harvest festivals, when entire communities were gathered, ensuring the maximum number of witnesses to their atrocities. They would target religious celebrations, desecrating churches with unspeakable acts against women to combine spiritual horror with physical violation. They would select market days, guaranteeing that traders would carry the horrifying stories to distant communities. Forcing male relatives to bear witness was a standard, cruel practice. Husbands watched as their wives were defiled, fathers as their daughters were taken, and brothers as their sisters were selected for servitude. The psychological destruction of men through witnessing the suffering of their female family members created broken populations, utterly incapable of resistance. These men would then spread stories of their own helplessness, compelling others to flee rather than face similar impotence. These stories, a core part of this dark history, spread with specific details that only amplified the terror. It was not just that women were taken, but how they were systematically sorted. Not merely that they were enslaved, but the precise fates that awaited the different categories. The sheer precision of the horror, the cold, organizational efficiency of the suffering, made the threat seem utterly inescapable. Resistance appeared futile when the enemy had so effectively industrialized brutality. Some Saxon chronicles even suggest that the Vikings deliberately released certain captives to spread these very stories. Women who had witnessed but not personally experienced the worst of the violations were set free to carry warnings to other settlements. They were transformed into unwitting instruments of propaganda. Their testimony was far more credible than any Viking threat because they had seen the grim reality firsthand. This multiplication effect meant the Vikings could conquer more through reputation than through actual combat. For every single settlement they attacked, 3 others might evacuate based on the stories alone. For every one woman actually forced into slavery, dozens of others would flee to escape that potential fate. This weapon of terror turned localized Viking raids from simple disasters into regional evacuations. The economic benefits of this strategy were substantial. Abandoned settlements could be looted without a fight. Fleeing populations left behind anything too cumbersome to carry. The Vikings amassed great wealth without ever risking their warriors in battle. This psychological warfare made conquest extraordinarily profitable, with minimal actual fighting. Religious communities were particularly susceptible to these terror tactics. Monasteries and convents that sheltered refugees would hear the harrowing, detailed accounts of these atrocities. These accounts would then be meticulously recorded in their chronicles, spreading through religious networks that stretched across entire kingdoms. A single assault on a religious house could broadcast terror throughout Christian networks, cementing this dark history for generations. But some women found ways to resist that terrified even the Vikings. The midnight poisoning in Jarl Hakon's hall left 12 of his warriors dead by dawn. They were discovered in grotesque positions, with foam dried on their lips, their faces frozen in a final, agonizing expression. The Irish thrall, Deirdre, stood calmly among the bodies, making no attempt to hide or escape. When they seized her, she said simply, "It was worth it." She had been captured 3 years earlier when Vikings raided her family's farm near Cork. She had been forced to watch as they murdered her husband and eldest son. Her younger children had been taken into slavery, scattered across different settlements. She was brought to Hakon's hall as a brewing specialist, her deep knowledge of herbs and fermentation making her valuable for producing their mead. That very same knowledge, however, had also provided her with a weapon. She knew which mushrooms, common in the Norwegian forests, would cause a devastating death if prepared correctly. She had been patiently gathering them for months, drying them and grinding them into a powder indistinguishable from common spices. She waited for the victory celebration, when the warriors would drink heavily, when one more ingredient in the mead would go unnoticed. Her execution took 3 days. They broke her on the wheel, taking special care to prolong her suffering, but witnesses noted she never screamed, never begged, never showed regret. She spoke only once more, asking if all 12 were dead. When told, yes, she smiled. That smile haunted the survivors more than her victims' deaths. Deirdre was not unique. Across the Viking world, enslaved women found ways to resist that, ranged from subtle sabotage to spectacular violence. Most paid with their lives, but their resistance, however futile it seemed, created complications for Viking slavery systems that required constant vigilance against the very women they had subjugated. Poison was the most common tool of resistance. Women who prepared food had access to kitchens, gardens, and brewing supplies. They learned which local plants caused illness versus death. Some engaged in slow poisoning that appeared to be natural disease. Others, like Deirdre, chose mass casualty events that sent messages, even though they guaranteed their own deaths. A Welsh woman named Ceres killed 3 masters over 5 years before being caught. Each death appeared natural. The first seemed to die of food poisoning, the second of a wasting disease, the third of sudden heart failure. Only when the 4th master grew suspicious and had his food tested did they discover she had been using small doses of mercury, available from metalworking, to slowly poison each owner. Her knowledge came from her father, who had been a healer before Vikings killed him. Arson provided another avenue for resistance. A Frankish group of thralls coordinated the burning of Hedeby's slave market in 943. They had gathered lamp oil slowly, hiding it in various locations. On a night when strong winds blew from the west, they set fires simultaneously at 6 points around the market. The conflagration destroyed not just the slave pens, but significant portions of the trading post. 17 of the 20 women involved died in the flames they set, choosing immolation over recapture. Infanticide, devastating to mothers but seen as mercy compared to condemning children to slavery, occurred regularly. Women would smother newborns or abandon them in forests, choosing grief over watching another generation enslaved. Norse law treated this as property destruction, but no punishment could be worse than what drove mothers to kill their own children. Information warfare became a subtle but effective resistance. Women who learned Norse could spy on their masters, passing intelligence to other slaves or even to enemies of their captors. A Saxon woman named Elfwin spent 7 years pretending to understand less Norse than she actually knew, gathering information that she eventually passed to English forces planning resistance against Viking expansion. Some women seduced Viking men specifically to kill them. They would earn trust through apparent submission, gain access to private spaces, then strike when victims were most vulnerable. A Slavic woman named Ruza killed 5 Viking leaders over 3 years by becoming their concubine, waiting until they trusted her completely, then cutting their throats while they slept. Suicide pacts among captured women prevented Vikings from obtaining expected value from raids. Entire groups would agree to kill themselves rather than serve as slaves. Mass drownings, deliberate starvation, or collective poisonings would destroy the economic value of raids. Vikings sometimes found themselves with ships full of corpses rather than valuable slaves. Religious resistance took forms Vikings found particularly disturbing. Christian women would engage in extreme fasting that destroyed their health and value. They would deliberately disfigure themselves to reduce their worth. Some would enter catatonic states through intensive prayer, becoming living corpses that couldn't work or serve any purpose. Physical resistance, though usually futile, occasionally succeeded. A group of Irish women overpowered their guards during transport, killed them with their own weapons, and sailed the ship back to Ireland. Most couldn't navigate and died at sea, but 3 ships are recorded as having been successfully returned by escaped slaves who had learned basic sailing from watching their captors' long-term resistance through cultural preservation. Also threatened Viking domination. Women would secretly teach their children Christianity, Irish law, Saxon customs, or other traditions from their homelands. They maintained languages Vikings had tried to erase. They preserved genealogies that Vikings wanted forgotten. This cultural resistance created identity conflicts in children who were supposed to be fully assimilated. Vikings, the price for any resistance was severe: the blood eagle execution, where ribs were broken outward to resemble wings, and lungs pulled out to flutter like wings, was sometimes used for women who had killed masters. Mass executions of uninvolved slaves would follow individual acts of resistance. creating pressure within slave communities against rebellion. But resistance continued because for many women, death with defiance seemed preferable to life without dignity. Their actions, though, usually ending in their own deaths, created constant anxiety among Viking owners. The women they had enslaved and violated became potential threats that could strike at any moment through any meal, any drink, any night. When vigilance lapsed, their defiance is forgotten. But their suffering built an empire. Sigrid stands in the Angel of Death's tent on the Volga River's bank. The sixth warrior has just left. The old woman approaches with rope and blade in minutes. Sigrid will be smoke rising from a funeral ship, her last service to a master who owned her living and will own her dead. She represents one of hundreds of thousands whose names were deliberately forgotten, whose suffering was systematically erased, whose humanity was denied so completely that we know them only through their absence. The numbers tell only part of the story. Historians estimate that during the Viking Age, from roughly 793 to 11, more than 500,000 women were enslaved by Norse raiders and traders. But each statistic was someone's daughter, each sale was a family destroyed, each casual violation mentioned in sagas was trauma that shaped generations. Modern DNA studies reveal the genetic shadow of this massive forced migration. Iceland's population shows that while 62% of male lineage is Scandinavian, 63% of female lineage is Celtic, primarily Irish and Scottish. These percentages represent systematic abduction on a scale that permanently altered the genetic structure of entire populations. Iceland was literally built on stolen women. The infrastructure Vikings created for processing human females into property presaged later horrors. The markets at Dublin, Hedeby, and Novgorod established templates for human trafficking that would be refined during the Atlantic slave trade. The legal frameworks that erased female humanity provided precedents for other systems of dehumanization. The techniques for breaking resistance through systematic violation became standard in conflicts across centuries. What made Viking slavery particularly horrific was not its scale, though that was vast, not its brutality, though that was extreme. It was the complete normalization of female suffering as economic foundation. The wealth that funded Viking expansion came significantly from trafficking women. The genetic future of North settlements depended on forced reproduction by enslaved women. The social structures that maintained Viking society required female slaves as fundamental components. The same Vikings we celebrate as explorers were human traffickers. The same ones we admire as traders dealt primarily in human flesh. The same ones we romanticize as warriors were systematic perpetrators of violence against women. The longships we see in museums carried enslaved women in their holds. The gold artifacts we admire in exhibitions were purchased with profits from selling Irish girls in Byzantine markets. Every major Viking achievement was built on female suffering. The expeditions that reached North America were funded by slave profits. The trade networks that connected Scandinavia to Asia moved women as primary commodity. The settlements that became modern Nordic nations were populated through forced reproduction by enslaved women. The saga literature that preserves Viking history barely mentions these women. Except as property, they appear as background figures holding cups at feasts, working looms, existing only in relation to the men who owned them. Their voices were deliberately excluded from records. Their perspectives were considered unworthy of preservation. Their stories survive only in fragments in archaeological evidence, in DNA studies that reveal what written records tried to hide. Modern Scandinavia has largely forgotten this history. Museums focus on Viking ships, weapons, and exploration. Tourist attractions celebrate Viking strength and adventure. Popular culture presents Vikings as noble warriors or adventurous explorers. The systematic enslavement and violation of hundreds of thousands of women has been reduced to footnotes in broader narratives of Viking achievement. Dublin stands today as a modern European capital, its Viking history celebrated in museums and tourist attractions. But from 841 to 1170, it was Europe's largest slave market. The ground beneath its medieval section contains archaeological evidence of slave shackles, holding pens, and mass graves. The city was literally built on foundations of human trafficking. The women themselves have no memorials. No monuments mark where they suffered. No museums document their experiences. No popular culture remembers their names. They exist only as absences in the historical record, gaps where their voices should have been, silences that speak to the systematic erasure of female experience from history. But their DNA persists in millions of living people. Their suffering echoes in generational trauma that shaped cultures. Their resistance, however futile it seemed, demonstrated that human dignity could survive even systematic attempts to destroy it. They were not passive victims, but women who fought, endured, and preserved what they could of identity, despite impossible circumstances. Understanding Viking slavery is essential for an honest examination of European history. The wealth that kick-started medieval trade came significantly from trafficking women. The genetic structure of northern European populations was shaped by mass abduction and forced reproduction. The social systems that evolved into modern nations were built on foundations of systematic female subjugation. This history matters because patterns repeat. The targeting of women in conflict continues worldwide. The use of systematic violation as weapons of war persists. The erasure of female voices from the historical record remains ongoing. Understanding how Vikings industrialized female suffering helps recognize similar patterns in contemporary conflicts. Every Viking ship in every museum carried enslaved women. Every saga celebrating Viking heroes glosses over the women they enslaved. Every romanticized portrayal of Viking society ignores the hundreds of thousands of women whose suffering made that society possible. We name sports teams after Vikings. We watch television shows glorifying them. We consume entertainment that presents them as admirable while forgetting the women they consumed. Modern tourism to Scandinavia includes Viking attractions that present sanitized history. Visitors photograph themselves with Viking ship replicas without considering the enslaved women those ships carried. They buy souvenirs celebrating Viking culture without recognizing that culture was built on female suffering. They admire Viking artifacts without questioning how those artifacts were purchased. The women deserve recognition, not as nameless victims, but as individuals who faced impossible circumstances with whatever courage they could muster. They were daughters and mothers and sisters. They had names that were taken. They had stories that were silenced. They had potential that was destroyed by systematic violence that treated them as property rather than people. Sigrid had a name, though Ibn Fadlan never recorded it. She had a family in some Slavic village before Vikings arrived. She had a future that might have included marriage by choice, children raised in freedom, old age surrounded by grandchildren. Instead, she died at 19 on the Volga River, strangled and stabbed, and burned to serve a dead chieftain in an afterlife that probably never existed. But at least we can speak her name, even if we have to imagine it. At least we can acknowledge she existed. At least we can recognize that her suffering was not a footnote to Viking achievement, but central to how that achievement was funded. She was one of 500,000. This is her only memorial until now. The Angel of Death tightens the rope around Sigrid's neck. The blade slides between her ribs. The fire consumes the ship, sending smoke across the Volga River toward the eastern sky. Witnesses cheer the chieftain's glorious departure for Valhalla. No one mourns the girl who burns beside him. No one speaks her name. No one records her story. But she existed. They all existed. 500,000 women whose names were deliberately forgotten, whose suffering funded an empire, whose bodies built a civilization that celebrated their erasure. They deserve more than silence. They deserve more than footnotes. They deserve recognition that Viking achievement was purchased with their blood, their violation, their enslavement, their lives. The smoke rises from the burning ship, carrying Sigrid to whatever comes after life. The crowd disperses, satisfied with the ceremony's success. Tomorrow, Vikings will raid another village, capture another group of women, continue the machinery of human trafficking that funded their civilization. History celebrates the Vikings as explorers and warriors. It forgets the women they destroyed. But DNA remembers. Genetics carries the evidence that saga literature tried to erase. Every person of Northern European descent likely carries genetic markers from both Vikings and their victims, embodying in their cells the history that written records tried to forget. The accounting is not complete. It never can be. Too many names were lost. Too many stories were silenced. Too many women disappeared into slavery and death without any record of their existence. But we can acknowledge the pattern. We can recognize the systematic nature of Viking slavery. We can understand that what happened to these women was not accident or excess, but fundamental to how Viking society functioned. Sigrid died in 922. She was approximately 19 years old. She had been enslaved for 2 years. She was one of hundreds of thousands. This is all we know. This is more than most enslaved women received. This is still not enough. But it is a beginning. Recognition that they existed, acknowledgement that they suffered, understanding that their suffering was not marginal, but central to Viking society. Appreciation that they were not property but people whose humanity was denied by systems that needed their labor, their bodies, their lives. The fire consumes the ship, the smoke dissipates across the river, the crowd returns to their daily lives. Sigrid becomes nothing but ash and memory, and then not even memory, just one more forgotten woman whose suffering built the Viking Age. She deserved better. They all deserve better. The least we can do is remember that they existed, that they mattered, that their suffering was real and systematic and fundamental to the civilization we still celebrate. This was their only memorial until now, until we chose to speak their silenced names, to recognize their erased existence, to acknowledge that Viking achievement was built on their bodies, their violation, their blood. Sigrid is gone, but her story, imagined though it must be, represents hundreds of thousands of real women who suffered real horrors that funded real Viking expansion. They were not myths or exaggerations. They were people whose humanity was systematically denied by a civilization that needed their suffering to function. Remember them. Remember Sigrid. Remember the 500,000 whose names we will never know. They were the foundation of Viking achievement, the invisible suffering that made visible glory possible. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.